At the bottom of the world's oceans rest the remains of a war that was never formally declared, but which came close to destroying civilization on more than one occasion. The Cold War was fought on multiple simultaneous fronts: in nuclear weapons laboratories, in intelligence agencies, in space races, and in the skies where spy planes flew over enemy territory. But one of its most silent, most secret, and most dangerous fronts was the one that developed under the ocean, where the submarines of the two superpowers patrolled continuously, ready to launch nuclear missiles if the order came, spying on the enemy's communications and tracking rival fleets with a discretion that deep water guaranteed better than any stealth technology. Some of those submarines never returned to the surface, and what researchers have found when they finally located them, decades later, reveals secrets of an underwater war that the world still does not completely know. Leave your like, subscribe, and share. Let us begin. The year 1968 was, for reasons that still puzzle naval historians, the most catastrophic year of the Cold War for the submarine fleets of the world. In that single year, 4 submarines from 4 different countries disappeared in different but equally tragic circumstances, taking their crews with them and becoming mysteries that in some cases would take decades to be partially resolved. The temporal coincidence of these 4 tragedies in the same year has no satisfactory explanation, and their accumulation in such a short period speaks to the level of risk to which submarine crews were subjected during the Cold War. Men who operated machines of extreme technological complexity in conditions of pressure, danger, and secrecy that the general public never fully knew. The USS Scorpion, with the designation SSN 589, was a nuclear attack submarine of the United States Navy that disappeared in May 1968 in the Atlantic while returning to its base in Norfolk, Virginia, after a patrol in Mediterranean waters. Aboard were 99 sailors. The Scorpion never reached port, and for months the American Navy conducted an extensive search in the Atlantic waters without finding a trace of the vessel. Finally, in October 1968, the submarine was located at the bottom of the Atlantic at a depth of approximately 3,000 meters, about 700 kilometers southwest of the Azores. What researchers found when they were able to examine the remains with underwater vehicles was a scene of destruction that raised more questions than it answered. The Scorpion's hull showed evidence of a catastrophic implosion, the type of destruction produced when the structural integrity of a submarine fails and the external water pressure crushes the hull in milliseconds, killing the entire crew instantly. The exact causes of the Scorpion's sinking have never been established with total certainty, and that uncertainty has fed theories for decades, ranging from the failure of one of its own torpedoes to the intervention of Soviet forces. The Soviet espionage theory has been particularly persistent, based on the coincidence that the Scorpion had been assigned to monitor Soviet naval operations in the Atlantic before its sinking, and on the suspicion that the Soviets might have had knowledge of its position. The official American Navy investigations concluded that the most likely cause was an accident related to the torpedo system aboard, but without survivors or a black box that recorded the submarine's final moments. The uncertainty could never be completely eliminated. The remains of the Scorpion remain at the bottom of the Atlantic with its 99 crew members, and the site has been declared a war grave by the United States Navy. 5 years before the Scorpion, in April 1963, the American Navy had suffered another equally devastating loss that marked a before and after in the history of nuclear submarines. The USS Thresher, with the designation SSN 593, was the first submarine of its class and one of the most advanced of its era when it disappeared during deep dive tests in the Atlantic, about 300 kilometers east of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Aboard were 129 people, among sailors, officers, and civilians participating in the tests. The Thresher was the first nuclear submarine to sink in history, and its loss deeply shook the American Navy and the military establishment in general, because it demonstrated that even the most advanced technology of the era was vulnerable to catastrophic failures in the extreme conditions of the deep ocean. The bathyscaphe Trieste II located the remains of the Thresher scattered on the Atlantic floor at a depth of approximately 2,600 meters. The dispersion of the remains was consistent with an implosion followed by an explosion, probably of the nuclear propulsion systems, which had literally disintegrated the submarine. The subsequent investigation determined that the probable cause was a rupture in the high-pressure seawater piping system, which flooded the machinery compartment and caused the reactor shutdown. leaving the Thresher without propulsion at a depth at which it was impossible to stop the descent toward depths where the water pressure exceeded the structural limits of the hull. The sinking of the Thresher led to profound reforms in the construction, testing, and operation procedures of American Navy submarines, a program known as SubSafe that transformed the safety standards of the submarine fleet and which analysts attribute to the prevention of similar accidents in subsequent decades. Leave your like, subscribe, and share. The case of Soviet submarine K-129 is perhaps the most extraordinary of all Cold War wrecks, not so much for the circumstances of its sinking as for what happened after it was located. The K-129 was a Soviet diesel-electric submarine armed with nuclear ballistic missiles that disappeared in February 1968 in the North Pacific, northwest of the Hawaiian Islands. The Soviets launched a massive search but failed to find it. What they did not know was that the United States Navy, using its underwater hydrophone network known as the SOSUS system, had detected the sound of the K-129's implosion at the moment it occurred, and had been able to triangulate its position with sufficient precision for the Americans to find it before the Soviets themselves did. The K-129 lay at approximately 4,900 meters depth, a depth that in 1968 was practically inaccessible for any underwater vehicle of the era. The Americans knew the submarine was there, knew that aboard there were nuclear missiles, cryptographic keys, and intelligence documents of incalculable value, but had no way to reach it. What the CIA designed to solve that problem is one of the most audacious and secret engineering projects in the history of American intelligence. Project Azorian, as it was classified, consisted of building a special recovery ship, the Hughes Glomar Explorer, under the cover of being a seabed mineral extraction drilling platform financed by magnate Howard Hughes as a credible distraction. The real objective was to lower a giant grappling system to the nearly 5,000 meters of depth where the K-129 lay and lift the complete submarine to the surface. The operation was carried out in 1974, 6 years after the sinking, and its result was partial. The grappling system managed to capture the K-129, but during the ascent the submarine's hull, weakened by years of pressure and corrosion, broke apart, and only a section of approximately 30 meters reached the surface. That section contained, according to subsequently declassified information, the bodies of several Soviet sailors whom the CIA buried at sea with full military honors in a ceremony that was filmed and that decades later was shared with the Russian government. Cryptographic codes, technical manuals, and other intelligence materials were also recovered, whose exact content remains classified to this day. What remained of the K-129 at the bottom of the Pacific is still there, at nearly 5,000 meters depth, with the rest of its crew and with the secrets the CIA could not recover. In the same fateful year of 1968, 2 other submarines disappeared in circumstances that also took decades to be partially clarified. The French submarine Minerve disappeared in January 1968 in the Mediterranean, near the coast of Toulon, with 42 crew members aboard. For 50 years, the French Navy conducted periodic searches without finding a trace of the Minerve. It was finally located in July 2019, at a depth of 2,035 meters in the Mediterranean, by a search team using state-of-the-art sonar technology. The state of the remains suggested that the Minerve suffered a sudden catastrophic failure, although the exact cause remains undetermined with absolute certainty. The INS Dakar, an Israeli submarine that also disappeared in January 1968, did so in the eastern Mediterranean while navigating from Great Britain to Israel after having been sold by the British Navy to Israel. Aboard were 69 Israeli sailors. The Dakar was searched for 31 years until in 1999 it was located at the bottom of the Mediterranean at a depth of approximately 2,900 meters, about 500 kilometers west of the Israeli coast. The finding was of enormous importance for Israel, where the Dakar and its 69 crew members had remained in collective memory for more than 3 decades as one of the most painful symbols of the sacrifices of the country's armed forces. The submarine's emergency beacon was found separated from the rest of the hull in a position that suggested the crew had attempted to activate the emergency systems before the final sinking. Also worth mentioning is the USS Stickleback, a different case from the other lost Cold War submarines because its sinking was not the consequence of a technological failure or enemy action, but of a collision with a vessel from its own fleet. In May 1958, the Stickleback collided with the destroyer USS Silverstein during maneuvers near Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, The impact damaged the stickleback to such an extent that it was impossible to save it, and it sank in Pacific waters. Fortunately, in this case, the entire crew was rescued, making the stickleback one of the few cases of the loss of a submarine during the Cold War without human casualties. The technology these submarines represented was in itself a testimony to the level of investment the two superpowers were willing to make to maintain their strategic advantage beneath the ocean. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union developed submarines of the Typhoon class, the largest vessels ever built, with hulls made of titanium to withstand greater depths and coated with special rubber materials to reduce their acoustic signature and make them more difficult to detect by enemy sonar systems. Each technological advance on one side was answered with a corresponding advance on the other, in an underwater arms race that consumed incalculable resources and produced both extraordinary technological innovations and equally extraordinary human tragedies. What the Cold War wrecks tell us today, viewed from the distance of decades, is that the nuclear deterrence that maintained peace between the superpowers had a real and continuous human cost that was rarely publicly acknowledged. The sailors of the Scorpion, the Thresher, the K-129, the Minerve, and the Dakar did not die in combat. They died in the daily exercise of a mission that consisted of being ready for a war that none of them desired and that they hoped would never have to be fought. Their submarines remain at the bottom of the ocean, involuntary monuments to an era in which humanity bet its survival on a balance of terror that, for reasons still debated, did not become the nuclear apocalypse it so greatly feared. Leave your like, subscribe, and share. Until next time.